A commenter asked what I thought about Fire Emblem Engage, and I'm so here for it, so that's what we're gonna do. While I haven't personally played, and there's a lot of reasons why that I haven't, and I won't dive into all of them, I do think it's a really good game and an important part of the franchise so far. The thing is, with people hating on the game, is that they didn't understand what it was for, and I don't think that's the fault of the Fire Emblem team, because it was fairly clear fairly early on what kind of game this was going to be like. This is a love letter to the series so far, and it dives into a lot of the combat and strategy elements that are present throughout the games, which was going to naturally kind of gravitate away from a narrative and story standpoint, which is where a lot of the complaints that I hear about come from. So it sounds to me like the marketing team did the best they could to set up expectations for this game, and it still didn't quite pan out because that's just how people are. For example, Darkest Dungeon 1 versus Darkest Dungeon 2. Everybody loved Darkest Dungeon 1. When a second game came out, no one liked it. Not because it was bad, but because it wasn't Darkest Dungeon 1. They were constantly comparing it to the first game. They wanted that experience again. And instead of playing that game again, they just wanted them to, make another, which isn't really how game development works because of diminishing returns. It's getting more and more expensive to develop games these days, and you have to make sure you're making something new enough that you're going to draw in a bigger audience while retaining your main audience. But because of the way content has developed in a very hashtagable kind of world, there's a lot of cubbies that people expect content to fall into. And they don't tend to want to leave those boxes. So the market's kind of backed themselves into a corner on this one because it's this, feedback loop situation where we are seeing an impact to media literacy going down, so they make stories simpler, which means no one gets a chance to practice media literacy. So it's kind of that sort of situation influencing the market as a whole, also affecting this. But also because Fire Emblem as a series has cultivated an audience that's very narrative and story driven. So a game that's going to focus mostly on combat and strategy elements from across the franchise at the expense of narrative and story is always going to be a little bit tough of a sell. But again, I do think it was very important because it has that nostalgia factor. That's why you've got people who have 70 plus hours in this game, because they do appreciate the combat mechanics, and it's fun to fight in this game and use the strategy available to you from different games across the franchises. So the way support conversations are structured and how quickly they come around is different. The bond conversation being a totally different thing with the rings that are a callback to heroes. There's a lot of fun things going on gameplay and mechanic-wise in this game that players did enjoy. And that's why you're seeing that 9 out of 10 rating, 4 out of 5 rating with it all the time. Because they really, really liked that element. That one thing it didn't do to seal the deal was narrative and story elements. Characterization, things like that. Because they've cultivated the audience that really likes those things, especially with Houses and Hopes, we're more houses than hopes, but it really delved into the politics and culture and the concepts of war and the influences of who's an enemy, what does that even mean? What is the point of war? What kind of governing body is the best? How do you institute change? These are all very big, deep questions that Engage was not going to tackle. That was not the point of that game. So it's hard for me to say that that's a failing on the part of Engage, because I don't think it is. I think Engage did what it set out to do. And that it's important to take these kind of narrative breaks in a franchise, especially when you've got something like Fire Emblem that was kind of revived by Fire Emblem Awakening, making things more accessible for players who were coming into the series and didn't want to be challenged all the time. They wanted some challenge, but they were really here for the narrative and the story element. But there is a history there, and acknowledging that history makes the long-term gamers feel appreciated and helps the new gamers understand the concepts of these things from previous games in a more modernized way that's not quite as difficult as it was in those original games, while also having a nod to the mobile gamers and trying to convert them to a console audience. So there is a sales effort here, there's also a marketing effort here. So there's a sales effort here, there's also a marketing effort here, and those aren't bad things. We want this game franchise to continue. And if we want it to continue, it has to do things that foster more people to join the community. Even if we don't all love the game completely, it's still a good, solid entry into the Fire Emblem franchise and does a very important thing narratively as well, because it's not as intense as other games. It's a game you can play that's low energy, that's low stress. When things are really stressful in life, because things get stressful, it's always good to have an option within a game franchise that you love to be a comfort game. And that's what this kind of turned out to be. And this isn't to say that the narrative or the stories are bad in this game either. I think that's an important thing to mention, is that these characters are designed in such a way to be fun, but not necessarily deep. A lot of them, from what I've heard and what I've seen in fandom as I've paid attention from the sidelines, they're a little tropey. And they commit to being that trope, though. And there's a reason these tropes and archetypes exist. They're fun, they're enjoyable to play with. So you have these concepts and these ideas with these characters that can be as simple or as deep as you would like. And that creates a lot of potential. Again, it doesn't require a lot of energy to engage with it. Sorry, pun not intended. Something like Houses does require a lot of insight and introspection and energy to engage with it. Engage doesn't necessarily demand that from you, which is a good thing, because you just had 2 games with a very lore and culture heavy story. It's a lot. So it's nice to have kind of a breather between those 2 things. And it doesn't mean the narrative or story is exactly bad. It's just not 3 Houses or 3 Hopes, which was not as narratively strong as 3 Houses, but you get the idea. People are comparing it to 3 Houses and finding it wanting, because they aren't acknowledging that that's not what Engage is supposed to be. Or if they do acknowledge it, that's good, but it's just a preference in that point. Is like they prefer Houses. I know I personally would probably also prefer Houses to Engage, which is why I didn't pay full price for it. But if I see it on sale, I'm going to buy it because I'd love to play it. I just know that I'd be disappointed if I spent $60 or $70 on it, because it's not the kind of game I typically love. I'd like it, but I wouldn't love it. But I know that about myself, and I don't think it's a bad game just because I wouldn't adore it as much as I did 3 Houses.